Apply-Degger. Heidegger's thinking in Being and Time explained, with Simon Critchley. Episode 5, Throne Projection. In this episode, I'm going to be looking at Chapter 5 of Division 1 of Being and Time. And so what we've seen so far in Chapter 3 was an analysis of being in the world. Chapter 4, an analysis of being with others. And those things are both important. But Chapter 5 gives us a kind of conceptual infrastructure or undergirding to everything that we've seen so far. It's a really long and not complicated. There's a lot of moving parts in this chapter. And so we're going to try and get the structure of it clear in this episode and continue with it into the next episode on inauthentic life, where we're also going to talk about language. But once we've got a grasp on the concepts laid out in Chapter 5, then we're already prepared, or always already, as Heideggerians would say, always already prepared for the definition of the being of Dasein as care, which is really the whole thrust of Division 1 of Being and Time. The being of Dasein is care. But what does that really mean? So what we have to do is to see a whole run of argument, which really begins in Chapter 5, paragraph 28, through to Chapter 6, paragraph 42, to see that run of argument as a single arc. And then after we've looked at that single arc, in episode, episode 7, we'll look at the meaning of the being of Dasein as care, really what that means. And then in episode 8, we will look at the paragraphs 43 and 44, which are really two kind of mini essays at the end of Division 1 on the question of reality and the question of truth. But we're moving on now into the kind of the core of what Heidegger's up to in this book. And I want to make that as clear as I possibly can. So let's make a start with the beginning of Chapter 5, which is paragraph 28. And the question here, again, and it sounds kind of stupidly obvious when it's put in the way Heidegger describes it himself. But Heidegger's question in Chapter 5 is, what is the being of the there for Dasein? Dasein is being there. What is the being of the there? What does it really mean to be there? That's the kind of obviousness of the question that Heidegger's asking. Now, we know a number of things already. We know that the there of Dasein's place, where Dasein is Dasein is being in the world. So Dasein is in the world, and that world is a world that absorbs Dasein, which benumbs Dasein, a world with which Dasein is fascinated. And we also know from paragraph 12 earlier that the in of Dasein's being in the world is not the in of water in a glass or a piece of cheese in a fridge or a hamster in its cage. It's not the inness of a present-at-hand thing inside another thing. So the way we are in the world is not like that. So we've got some of this argument has been prepared. But what you feel in this chapter at the beginning of it is the difficulty of what Heidegger wants to say, and also the obviousness of what Heidegger wants to say. So, for example, on page 170, he says, this is a little quotation, being in, topic of the chapter, being in is an essential kind of being of this entity itself, Dasein. But then he says it would be not correct to talk about this, the being of this entity as a subject in the world of objects. We know that that's the wrong approach. We've got rid of that. He then goes on to say it would be more accurate to describe Dasein, the human being, as the being of the between. He says, in quotation marks, the being of the between. And he says, well, that's not right either, because to say that Dasein is, the there of Dasein is between selves or human things and world-like things is to assume that there's a between in the first place, that there's a difference between these two sets of entities. And Heidegger doesn't want to begin from that premise. He wants to begin from the idea of the unity of Dasein as being in the world. And then still on this page 170, he makes a very interesting remark. He says, what is decisive for ontology is to prevent the splitting of the phenomenon. To prevent the splitting of the phenomenon. So even to say that Dasein is the being of the between selves and things, presupposes the existence of two types of things and a between them. And Heidegger wants to avoid that splitting. He wants to think about Dasein as being in the world as a unity and to hang on to that unity. And then as he's kind of, clearing his throat, clearing the ground in this chapter, you can see him kind of wrestling with this thought. He says that Dasein is itself, it's there, right? Dasein is there being, its being is there, and this there has always been disclosed. He drops this term into the beginning of the chapter, disclosure, which is going to become a really important term in Heidegger's vocabulary because it's going to define the nature of truth, ultimately, for Heidegger. But here he just drops it in. He says that we are there and that there is disclosed to us, kind of always already. And I'm just going to quote a tiny bit more. This is from 171 of Macquarie and Robinson. Just a few lines. He says, when we talk of the natural light in man, the lumen naturale, he says, the natural light of reason is the way it's normally configured in, say, Descartes. And he's going to take that idea of natural light and shift it. But to go back to the text, when we talk in a figurative way of the natural light in man, we have in mind nothing other than the existential ontological structure of this entity, that it is in such a way as to be its there. It is in such a way as to be its there. To say that it is illuminated, erleuchtet, he says in German, means that as being in the world, it is cleared, gelichtet, in itself, not through any other entity, but in such a way that it is itself the clearing. It is itself the clearing. So Dasein is disclosed, is lit up, is cleared, and it is itself the clearing. That's the thought. Only for an entity, he says, which is existentially cleared in this way, does that which is present at hand become accessible along with it. If it lacks its there, it is not factically the entity which is essentially Dasein. Indeed, it is not this entity at all. Dasein is its disclosedness. Dasein is its disclosedness. And this disclosedness that we are is described in these light metaphors. Dasein is lighting, is clearing. And furthermore, Dasein, us, we, are not cleared or disclosed through any other entity. We're not cleared or revealed, or we don't come into the truth through a relationship to God or to nature or to reason or any conception of being, whether being is a unity, let's say as it was for Plato and the Neoplatonics, or being as a kind of multiplicity, as it is in figures, say, like Deleuze and Badiou. All of that is just metaphysical talk. We are the kind of beings who are cleared through ourselves. We are ourselves the clearing. We are disclosedness. That's the thought. And we have to begin from that thought. So the question in this chapter is, what is the in of Dasein's being in? What is the there of Dasein's being there? Well, that in and that there are our disclosedness in the clearing, a clearing which we ourselves are. It doesn't come through any external agency. And the structure of this chapter, like many of the chapters in Being and Time, is a twofold structure. There's part A and part B. In part A, he advances the three key existential concepts in chapter 5. Those concepts are state of mind, understanding, and language or discourse, and we'll come to those in a few minutes. These are the three existentials. And then in part B of the chapter, if Dasein is disclosure, then Dasein is also covered over. Dasein is covered up insofar as that it exists in average, everyday inauthenticity. And so the second part of the chapter, which we'll get to next week, is described under the concept of falling, das Verfallen. And there are three concepts which mirror the three concepts of state of mind, understanding, and language. The three existential concepts are mirrored in three, as it were, fallen concepts for inauthentic concepts: idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity. And we'll come to those next time. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the chapter itself, chapter 5, is a movement between A and B, between existential concepts and factical concepts, between things being disclosed and closed over. So Dasein is disclosure, is itself the lighting, the clearing, but it's a clearing that can be covered up in average, everyday life. And what Heidegger's trying to describe in this chapter is the movement, the kinesis. The word he uses in German is Bewegung, the movement of disclosure and covering up, or unconcealment and concealment, that describes the being of Dasein. And this is the good bit, which we'll come back to when we get to the concept of truth. This is the concept of truth for Heidegger. Truth is also a movement, a rhythmical movement between disclosure or unconcealment and covering over and concealment. And why I'm emphasizing this is that learning to read Heidegger and think with Heidegger is about learning the rhythm of Heidegger's thinking, which is the rhythm of our becoming, the rhythm of our existence. The rhythm of our existence is a motion between disclosure and closure, existence and facticity. As we'll see in a moment, projection and thrownness, authenticity and inauthenticity. The point of reading Heidegger is to learn that rhythm of thinking, our openedness. What I've emphasized in these episodes, our openness as a movement, as a rhythm of disclosure and things being closed off. And to think of it rhythmically is also to think of it musically. There is a kind of music to being in time, a rhythm of disclosure and closure. And in many ways, I think that what Heidegger's driving at in this book could also be thought of in terms of our experience of music. The problem that Heidegger faces is that that experience of music is an experience of rhythm and motion and cadence and counterpoint is frozen in the static language of philosophy. So how does that frozen language of philosophy get loosened up, become rhythmical? That's really what he's trying to do in this chapter. And it's a hard thing to do. Okay, so that's kind of the clearing the ground to the chapter. Let me now run through the key claim in this chapter, which is the idea of throne projection, and try and lay out the, if you like, the concept clusters that run through chapter 5. So let's back up and move in we're going to cover a lot of ground here, cover a lot of words in Heidegger, and try and get an overview of the terrain. Okay. Heidegger seeks to reawaken perplexity about the question of being, this huge issue, which has been the defining issue of metaphysics for 3,000 years. And in Being and Time, he pursues this question of being through an analysis of the human being, what he calls Dasein. And this by now is self-evident to us. And the being of Dasein is existence, understood as average, everyday existence of our life in the world. The question in chapter 5 really is, how might we give some more content, more of a kind of a feel to this rather formal idea of existence? Now, in chapter 5, the central claim of this chapter, which is only deepened in the remainder of Being in Time, the thought doesn't change, it's just deepened. So once you've got this structure clear in your mind, then all that Heidegger is going to do in the remainder of the book is kind of burrow down further into that structure. But this is the central claim of the book. That Dasein is throne projection. Dasein is throne projection. And in German it sounds even, sounds nicer. Dasein ist geworfener Entwurf. Dasein is a throne throwing off. Let me try and unravel this thought. Heidegger tends to advance his investigation in Being in Time in concept clusters. One cluster, the first cluster really presented in chapter 5, contains 3 concepts. And those 3 concepts are state of mind, mood, and throneness. State of mind, mood, and throneness. Now, state of mind, what does that mean in English? It doesn't really suggest anything. It's a rather questionable rendering of the German term Befindlichkeit. Right? You can say in German, or you say in German, Wie befinden Sie sich? How are you? Which really means, how do you find yourself? How do you find yourself? So this idea of Befindlichkeit is really a question of how does one find oneself. The first English language writer to work on this question, to translate these terms, was the great father William Richardson, who died just a few years ago. I knew him well. He was a lovely, lovely man, Jesuit priest and a psychoanalyst. And Richardson, in his huge book on Heidegger from 1961, translates Befindlichkeit as already having found oneself there-ness. Already having found oneself there-ness, which is absolutely accurate, but incredibly ugly. not a very elegant way of putting it. But Heidegger's thought here is that the human being is always already found or disclosed somewhere. Is always disclosed in the there of its being in the world. This there is the there of Dasein, the Da of Dasein. So I'm always already found somewhere, right? How did you find yourself this morning? I just rolled back the sheets and there I was, quoting the words of the great Vivian Stanshall from the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band a long, long time ago. The idea here is that we're always already found somewhere. And how are we found? This introduces the second concept. We're always found in a mood. And the word here in German is Stimmung, which is mood, but kind of closer to an idea of attunement. And it's also linked to the idea of the tuning of a musical instrument, of a mood is a way in which we can be attuned to the world. Anyway, I'm always found in a mood. And this is a mood in the strong Aristotelian sense of pathos, of affection, of passion, the passions of the soul, the passions of the human being. So I'm always found in a mood, in a passion, something that befalls us and in which we find ourselves. Really importantly for Heidegger, the passions are not some psychological colouring for an essentially rational agent. So one way of thinking about passions is that we could think of ourselves as essentially rational beings, organised at our centre as a kind of a mind or an intellect, and then kind of gathered around that intellect are the passions that we fall into at different times. Heidegger's not going to take that view. For him, everything is a passion, everything is a mood, and indeed reason itself is a kind of passion, a certain kind of mood. So these moods are the fundamental ways in which we are attuned to the world. We're always attuned to the world in terms of a mood. I'm excited, I'm bored, I'm distracted, I'm engaged, I'm sleepy, I'm awake, whatever it might be. There's always a mood which we have. And indeed, musicologically, Stimmung, mood, is linked to tuning and pitch. One is always attuned to the world first and foremost, or as Heidegger will say, proximally and for the most part, most closely and mostly, one is attuned to the world through moods. And one of the compelling aspects of Heidegger's work for someone like me is his attempt to provide a description of moods, a phenomenology of moods, of the affects that make up our everyday life in the world. So rather than denigrating moods or subordinating passions to reason, which is considered to be primary, Heidegger gives us this rich description of the life of moods. And I find that really interesting. Now, what do those moods disclose? For Heidegger, those moods disclose the human being as thrown into the there of my being in the world. So this is the third concept in this little cluster: state of mind, having always already having found oneself there-ness, mood, and thrownness. So moods disclose me as thrown into the there of my being in the world. As Jim Morrison intoned many decades ago, into this world we're thrown. Thrownness is the simple awareness that we always find ourselves somewhere, delivered over to the world with which we are fascinated, a world that we share with others, right? So this is a really obvious thought, but kind of interesting thought, isn't it? That we didn't decide to come into being. We didn't kind of click our fingers and suddenly wake up into consciousness. No, rather we were always already there, always already existing. And then we find ourselves already existing when we wake up in the morning. We wake up in the morning, which is kind of, a nice surprise to have. We're factically there in a certain mood, a mood of, let's say, sleepiness at that point. And so thrownness is also linked to the dimension of the past. We'll come back to that. Okay, so at the end of chapter 5, Heidegger writes, "For as long as Dasein is, it remains in the throw." For as long as Dasein is, it remains in the throw. Namely, we are always caught up in our everyday life in the world, in the throw or in the throes of various moods, whether that's fear, boredom, excitement, or, as we'll see in episode 7, or anxiety, which we'll see is the kind of shadowy queen amongst moods, which we'll talk about. But Heidegger insists we're not just thrown, so we're always in the throw. We can't throw ourselves off. We're stuck with ourselves. We're riveted to ourselves. We are facts to ourselves. But he insists we're not just thrown into the world. Dasein can also throw off that thrownness in a movement that he calls projection. And this introduces the next kind of concept cluster in chapter 5, projection. And I think about projection as an idea of throwing off or throwing forth, rather than kind of, I like to think of myself as a person who has projects, something like that. Projection is more of an activity of throwing off or throwing forth, which is always a throwing forth from thrownness. This concept of projection comes up in an important discussion of the concept of understanding. So projection is linked to understanding. This is what takes place in paragraph 31 of Being in Time. Now, what does understanding mean? By understanding, Heidegger means understanding how to do something or how to operate something. That's the way he understands understanding. Understanding is being able to do something. The German is etwas können, right? Being able to do something, being capable of something. And it's strongly linked to a term which Heidegger uses in his discussion of authentic Dasein in Division 2 of Being in Time, which is characterized by the ability or potentiality to be. So understanding how to do something should be linked to this larger idea of ability, which is going to be described in deeper ways later in the book as potentiality for being, what he calls Sein können. That Dasein, us, we are the kind of beings who can, who have capability, who have potentiality as their being. So the thought here is that the human being is not just a being defined by being thrown into the world. It can also throw off that thrownness in a movement of projection. And as we're going to see later on, this is going to be a free projection, a projection where it seizes hold of its possibilities, where it acts in a concrete situation. The movement of projection, of potentiality, of ability, is the very experience, the experience of what Heidegger will call freedom. And this is, I think, very important, that freedom for Heidegger is not an abstract philosophical concept. It is an experience. It's the experience of the human being demonstrating its potential, enacting its potential through acting in the world. And to act in this way for Heidegger is to be authentic. So, human existence for Heidegger is defined by throne projection. And that's the key concept in chapter 5, the key concept which will deepen in Being and Time. Throneness is linked to our inauthentic, average, everyday life in the world, and projection is the ability to act freely and to become authentic. So, if all you take away from this episode is that idea that Dasein is throne projection, we are factically, we find ourselves in a world and we can throw forth from that being in the world. If you get that, the rhythm of that thought, that's all you need to take away from this episode. But, of course, there's always a but. There is a third concept which is introduced into chapter 5. So, and that third concept, the third existential, is what Heidegger calls discourse, or language, or I think better, talk. The word here in German is Rede, R-E-D-E, which was a perfectly good English word at least until the 17th century. For example, you can find Ophelia in Shakespeare's Hamlet. She speaks of hypocrites who reck not their own rede. Reck not their own rede, and rede there is discourse language. And indeed, Shakespeare in English is closer to, as it were, the Germanic roots of English than the stuff that we speak now. But that's another story, which I won't go into at this point. So, discourse, talk, language. For Heidegger, talk, or the capacity for expression, communication, is the way in which our life in the world becomes intelligible. It's the way in which the structure of our existence as throne projection becomes articulable. So Heidegger will say two things in these chapters, which are in a kind of contradictory relationship. He will describe these three existential concepts, state of mind, understanding, discourse, as, in his terms, equi-primordial. They are equal one to the other. And that's what he says. But if you think through the logic of what he's saying, then it is language, discourse, which is the condition of possibility for the articulation of us, of Dasein, as throne projection. If there were not language, there would not be us. We are linguistic beings. So Heidegger is part of, what is rather superficially called the linguistic turn in philosophy, Heidegger and the later Wittgenstein. But the idea here is rather more straightforward than that. Aristotle famously defined the human being as the word is translated as rational animal, anima rationale. The Greek there means an animal with the capacity for logos, for speech. So Heidegger disagrees with the idea of the human being as a rational animal and says, well, actually, what Aristotle is saying, that we're the kind of beings that have logos. And Heidegger decides to translate that idea of logos in the following way. He says, the human being shows itself as the being that talks. The human being shows itself as the being that talks. Now, buried in that seemingly kind of straightforward expression is Heidegger's definition of phenomenon. A phenomenon is that which shows itself, and his definition of logos as that which lets us see. So language lets us see that which shows itself. That's Heidegger's concept of phenomenology. So language, logos, is the human ability to disclose the world, the capacity to reveal a world that is shared and meaningful. So, to go back to the beginning of this chapter, if what defines us, Dasein, is disclosedness, that we are the clearing of our existence, then what makes that clearing possible is language. And we need to think carefully about what kind of language that is. Heidegger's going to have some words to say about this in the middle paragraphs of chapter 5, which we'll get to in a second. Because there can be, if you like, authentic language, full language, and there can be empty language, idle talk. So different ways of experiencing language. And Heidegger thinks that our fundamental activity as linguistic beings is not propositional. It is not something that takes place in philosophical propositions. It's something which is closer to the primal feeling or meaning of elemental words. So, chapter 5. Dasein is throne projection, right? And throne projection, which is articulated through discourse, through talk. So the three key concepts in chapter 5 are state of mind, throneness, understanding, meaning projection, and language, talk, discourse. But there is a fourth concept introduced in chapter 5, which I want to say a word about here. And that fourth concept is falling. And this concept can be also thought of as falling as a kind of ensnarement. And this is described at the end of chapter 5. So having described the three existentials that constitute the disclosure of Dasein, state of mind, understanding, and discourse, he goes on to describe those characteristics of our everyday being in the world, given that we live with the they, with them, most closely and mostly. And we'll get into this in more detail next time, but these three modes are three modes of falling. Now, what does Heidegger mean by falling? He insists that this is not a negative evaluation, in the same way as he insists that inauthenticity is not a value judgment, it's not a negative value judgment, so too falling is not a negative evaluation. It does not mean that we've fallen from a state of grace into a state of sin. Right? And that's very much on Heidegger's mind, that theological, that Christian way of looking at falling is kind of the framework Heidegger's pushing against. Rather, falling describes our usual way of being. Falling is not so much falling into the world, like Satan's descent from heaven to hell after the war in heaven, his descent into the kind of the mud pits of hell in Milton's Paradise Lost. It's a different kind of falling. The way I think about this is in the following terms. The way we think about falling is we think about falling as vertical. We fall down from one state to another, from grace to sin. Heidegger's idea of falling is that we fall towards the world, we fall at the world, we fall to it, and we're constantly falling towards the world because we're absorbed by the world and we're fascinated by it. So now we're right at the end of the chapter. I'm going to back up in a second, but I want to give you a taste of where this goes to at the end of the chapter. He'll say on page 220, he says, this term falling does not express any negative evaluation, but is used to signify that Dasein, the human being, is proximally and for the most part alongside the world of its concern. It doesn't mean that it is not. Falling also represents a positive possibility. In falling, our potentiality for being is still an issue, even if that's in the mode of inauthenticity. Dasein can fall because it understands and projects. And authenticity, Heidegger insists, authenticity is not some state that floats above falling everydayness. Authenticity is simply a modified way in which everydayness is seized upon, he says. And the the chapter finishes really with that thought on page 224. Let me read you a couple of lines. He says, in falling, nothing other than our potentiality for being in the world is an issue, even if in the mode of inauthenticity. Dasein can fall only because being in the world understandingly with the state of mind is an issue for it. On the other hand, authentic existence is not something which floats above falling everydayness. Existentially, it is only a modified way in which such everydayness is seized upon. Right? So all the authenticity means for Heidegger is a modification of our inauthentic existence, a shift in perspective, a shift which, of course, does not last forever. We always fall back into everydayness, so I can be having the most authentic day of my life, and then at a certain point, I'll start binge watching Netflix and fall asleep, and I slide back into inauthenticity, to awake the next morning, finding myself there, and then I think about what to do. Now, so that is the story in chapter 5. That is really what I want to communicate in this episode. There's a couple more words I'd like to say. I think on about fear and about interpretation. That sounds a bit strange, doesn't it? But in paragraph 30 of Being in Time, in chapter 5, there's this little discussion of fear, which is often ignored. It's very interesting. And he talks about fear in relationship to Aristotle's Rhetoric. It's a very important text for Heidegger, because in the Rhetoric, Aristotle discusses emotions. Why, we might ask, does Aristotle discuss emotions in the Rhetoric? Because rhetoric is that activity of speech, of language, which is meant to be persuasive, which is meant to arouse emotions in the hearer. So, rhetoric and emotion are tightly linked. Heidegger describes the Rhetoric of Aristotle, it's a lovely phrase, as the first systematic hermeneutic of the everydayness of being with one another. The first systematic hermeneutic of the everydayness of being with one another. And then he goes into discussion of fear, and in many ways what he's doing here, Heidegger, he's got his copy of Aristotle open and he's just copying down notes, really. Because for Aristotle, fear is fear of something happening. Fear is fear of something threatening, something possibly destructive. And it's opposed to confidence. And Heidegger just borrows this, echoes this. Fear discloses us, Dasein, in its there, as fearfully concerned with itself. So fear is a state of mind which is concerned with something threatening, with something threatening me in the world. And I think about, if you want an example of this, I'm bad at examples, therefore just choose absurd ones. Think about, if there was a giant bear in the studio now, huge giant bear appears at the window, 8 feet tall, clawing away, its mouth dripping with foam. I would feel threatened by that bear, right? He might come in and kill me. So I'd be scared of that bear. That would be a good response. So fear is always fear of something threatening. In this case, a giant bear. Why is that important? Why is that a thing? Well, when we get a little bit further on in Being in Time, when we get to chapter 6, Heidegger will make a distinction between fear and anxiety. Fear is fear of something, of some particular thing, a giant bear. So fear is determinate. Anxiety is anxiety in the face of nothing in particular, which is why Heidegger will say mysteriously in a lecture from 1929 called What is Metaphysics? He says, anxiety reveals the nothing. So fear is always fear of something in particular. Anxiety is anxiety in the face of nothing. Now, there's a lot more that we could say about fear, and it has a very passing place in Heidegger's analysis, but it's also a way in which we could think about Heidegger's relationship to others. The usual way of thinking about Heidegger is he's a rather ultimately solipsistic thinker who turns his back on the average, everyday character of existence, and authenticity is a kind of solipsistic rising up of the self in the face of the world of them. And that's a horribly distorted picture. And this discussion of fear is also a place in which, fear can be fear of something threatening, but fear is also fear about others, and I can fear for others. I can be afraid myself, but I can be fearful that the other might do something reckless with regard to what threatens him or her. So there can be a kind of co-state of mind, he says. He calls it a Mitbefindlichkeit, a co-state of mind with the other, which takes place through fear. So this is one place in Being in Time where others kind of light up. There is a kind of relational dimension to what Heidegger's describing here. I think about this in relationship to, say, I don't know, I used to fear for my mother. I feared for her, right? I had a co-state of mind fearing for her. I feared that things would go badly for her. Of course, in fearing for my mother, I'm also fearing for myself. I mean, I didn't want to lose my mother. But also you are involved in fear in a relation to another person. And so that's a dimension of Heidegger that isn't usually brought to light. The last thing I want to say is about interpretation. And I'll pick this up next time. But let me just kind of say a couple of words here in closing. What I'm thinking about now is paragraph 32, which is called Understanding and Interpretation. What Heidegger's trying to bring out here is something terribly, terribly simple, but very difficult to get a grip on. We have an understanding of the world. The world is that bunch of stuff, what he calls technically that referential totality of involvements which are significant to us. The world is that thing which hangs together and which is meaningful. We use things. We have a concern for things. We take things as things. So when I'm in the world, moving around the world, I take the coffee cup as a coffee cup. I take the table that I'm resting my notes on as a table, the door as a door. The things that surround us and which make up the stuff of the world are things that we understand, and the understanding is articulated when we take something as something. And this taking of something as something is what Heidegger calls interpretation. Interpretation. And I think that becomes clearer if you think about interpretation in relation to the German term that Heidegger uses, which is Auslegung. Auslegung, as the word it sounds like when you say the word, is laying out, the laying out of understanding. So interpretation for Heidegger is the laying out of our understanding of being in the world. He says at the beginning of paragraph 32, in interpretation, understanding does not become something different, it becomes itself. In interpretation, the things that we take as things become things that we understand. Right? And this is a little bit like the discussion of signs a few episodes back. That signs, if there's an exit sign over the door, I'm aware of that sign as a ready-to-hand piece of equipment, a piece of stuff in my world, which I can see as a sign, but I'm not aware of that in a present-at-hand way. I'm aware of that as a sign which functions in a world, which allows me to orientate in my world, but I'm aware of that, as Heidegger will say more technically, pre-propositionally. I take something as something, I lay that out, and that's interpretation. Now, what Heidegger's doing in these pages of paragraph 32, incidentally, is inventing a whole new field of philosophy that is called hermeneutics. This tradition of hermeneutics was developed decisively by Heidegger's student Hans-Georg Gadamer in his hugely important book, Truth and Method. But the core concepts are all in Heidegger, and that's fine. Interpretation, this is what Gadamer picks up. Interpretation, Heidegger says, is grounded in a threefold structure of forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. Forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. That is, we have the thing in advance of the interpretation that lays out that having. Right? We have the thing in advance of the interpretation. We always already are in the world, understanding it. Interpretation just lays that out. But we already have a grasp on things. And this leads, and I find this really suggestive. This is what I want to finish with today. This leads Heidegger to a discussion of meaning. Meaning. And he says in his terminology, meaning is that upon which something becomes intelligible as something. But that sounds a bit too fancy. The thought that he's trying to develop is that meaning is not some property that is independent of us. Meaning is not something we can perhaps find or lose. Rather, meaning is an existential of Dasein. Meaning is something that we do. We make meaning, or we are meaning. The world is significant to us. Meaning is that which gets articulated in an act of interpretive understanding. Dasein is meaningful. Only Dasein can be meaningful. If there were no Dasein, there would be no meaning. And where Dasein ceases to be, meaning ceases to be. Death. Death is the non-meaningful limit to life's meaning on a Heideggerian view. But let's think a little bit more about this idea of meaning. Because on 193, he makes a very interesting remark. He says, if we are inquiring about the meaning of being, listen to that, if we are inquiring about the meaning of being, our investigation does not then become a deep one, nor does it puzzle out what stands behind being. It asks about being itself insofar as being enters into the intelligibility of Dasein. The meaning of being can never be contrasted with entities or with being as the ground which gives entities support. What he's saying here is that meaning is not deep. Meaning is not deep. It sounds deep. It sounds, when we're talking about the meaning of being, this sounds deep. But to construe it as deep is to misconstrue it metaphysically. It sounds as if we're looking for something which lies behind our life in the world, some ground, some God or something. No, Heidegger says, being is superficial. It is phenomenal. It is something which happens on the surface of things. And I think this is hugely important, and it takes us back to that poem I quoted 2 episodes back from Fernando Pessoa, when Pessoa talks about seeing things, and what we see of things are things. What we see of things are things. Why would we see something and then think about something else? Or why would we think that that which we see is not real? That would require, Pessoa says, a sickness of the mind, a kind of illness. And philosophy is a kind of illness a lot of the time. Heidegger's point is that we have to be concerned with that which is, with being, insofar as it's intelligible to us, and it lies on the surface of things. Another way of putting this, maybe you'll like this, is that many readers of Heidegger see being as some kind of rabbit in a hat, right? They see it as some kind of rabbit in a hat that you can kind of pull out as a magic trick. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and everybody else, there is no rabbit. The point is learning to see the hat without wanting the rabbit. If you can see the hat without wanting the rabbit, then you're learning to think in a Heideggerian way. And that's the purpose of these episodes. So we'll pick it up next time with a discussion of language. I'll go over a couple of things with this idea of language and stretch it out a little bit further, and then we will plunge headlong into inauthentic life and look at the concepts of curiosity, ambiguity, and idle talk. But that's for next time. Thank you very much.